In Ukraine, the neo-Nazis don't refer to themselves as neo-Nazis. They say that they're simply nationalists, not nationalist socialists. See, both the Nazis and the USSR claim to be socialist governments, but as I've told you, among white organizations, they differentiate themselves from one another based on their political ideals. But that doesn't change that the Nazis were every bit as racist as the Soviets and the United States. All the eyes of the world are on Ukraine right now, particularly the Ukrainian army. But this isn't the first time that the Ukrainian army's been in the spotlight. The difference being that up until 10 days ago, practically all the stories about the Ukrainian army have been negative. In fact, there had been, up until 10 days ago, a consistent media narrative about Ukraine in general, that it had become arguably the central nexus for white nationalists and white extremists worldwide, and Ukrainian ultranationalists have been exporting their own brand of white extremism to the four corners of the planet, with lethal results. Now, the most prominent of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups is the so-called Azov Organization, which we'll call the Azov Regiment for the sake of this discussion. Now, Azov has entire businesses and social groups that they run. They've got their own online news service too, as well as summer camps to indoctrinate the next generation of race soldiers, and a vigilante force, their own brown shirts, who patrol Ukraine's cities right alongside the police. So these guys are part of the government. We're not going to play the game of pretending that, well, it doesn't count unless they confess to it. It's just like Kyle Rittenhouse and George Zimmerman, these white supremacist thugs. They're not operating in spite of the Ukrainian government. They're able to operate because of the Ukrainian government. Speaking of which, Azov even has their own political party, which they call National Core. So you see, Azov is well connected and being supported by all kinds of people in Ukrainian society. But the white media is not talking about any of that, at least not anymore. There's a media embargo on discussing Azov or any of the other white supremacist groups in Ukraine, or the connections and associations that Azov has had with white supremacists worldwide, particularly in the United States. Strange, because before now, that was the main thing the white media talked about whenever discussing Ukraine, that it was the global hotbed for neo-Nazis, a mecca for white supremacists from all over the world. You see, Vladimir Putin didn't start that narrative. The white media had been reporting it for a long time before he did. As you would expect, Ukraine has become ground zero, a breeding ground for a whole number of white extremist organizations, such as C-14. But there's also another Ukrainian neo-Nazi group that's just as bad as Azov. They're called Pravyi Sector. In English, it means right sector. And just like the Azov Regiment, Right Sector is also suspected in a number of assaults and murders, often of pro-Russian activists in Ukraine. And like the cancer they are, Right Sector has metastasized, spreading to other countries like France, the United States, even as far as Brazil, which has its own neo-Nazi subculture. Supporters of Brazil's right-wing extremist autocrat Jair Bolsonaro have displayed the Right Sector flag right alongside the Brazilian flag. 2015. The same white media who today refuses to say anything about Azov Battalion or any of the other Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups, who claim that Putin's accusations about neo-Nazis in Ukraine are false or otherwise overstated. Well, 8 years ago, they were writing stories about the U.S. Army trainers who had gone to Ukraine and the serious questions that had arisen regarding the Ukrainian men who they were training. The situation was so blatantly wrong that when the Russian Foreign Ministry brought up that U.S. Army personnel were training guys who wore swastikas on their uniforms, the white media didn't even bother to discount it. Instead, they referred to a military official who simply said that all the Ukrainians who were being trained had been thoroughly vetted, whatever that means, and that the Azov Regiment, who Newsweek refers to by name, had been excluded. They even mentioned that Azov's been called a neo-Nazi group. Now, this wasn't Russia Today who said this. This was Newsweek. And this was in 2015, only a year after the Maidan Revolution. The claim that Ukraine had a neo-Nazi problem was the main point of most of the articles that came out of these white media outlets. Sure, most of them were written before Zelensky became president, but at no point was the white media saying that the neo-Nazis in Ukraine weren't a problem or that they had otherwise been dealt with. Now you're probably wondering, if there's all of these neo-Nazis running around in the Ukrainian military, how come nobody's talked to them? Well, actually, the white media's talked to a lot of them. In March 2015, USA Today had actually made contact with Azov Regiment. They had talked to a spokesman for Azov Regiment who said that according to his estimate, between 10 and 20% of Azov Regiment are neo-Nazis. That's coming from a spokesman for that group. They admit that by their estimation, which we can be sure is really understated, undercounted, that as many as 1 out of every 5 members of Azov Regiment are neo-Nazis. The question wasn't whether or not they had neo-Nazis, just how many are there. Now, of course, the commanders of Azov Regiment, when they were asked about it, they denied all of it and said, hey, these are all just patriots, and we're going to talk to that guy who told you this, and he's going to have to be disciplined for this. He's spreading misinformation. So, has the U.S. government been giving money to Azov Regiment? Yes. Since at least 2015, Congress had put a provision into the defense bills to ban aid to Ukraine from going to Azov Battalion, but the very next year, 2016, the ban was lifted at the behest of the Pentagon. So someone, or a number of people in the Defense Department, were very, very eager to make sure that Azov Battalion got some funding from Washington, not to mention equipment as well. Now, members of Congress, mostly Democrats, had spent the next 3 years trying to put language back into the defense bill to prohibit funding to Azov Regiment, but they had been defeated 3 years in a row. Finally, in 2018, they got the language back into the defense bill, and it has allegedly been there ever since. But the damage had already been done. In 2015, according to the Daily Beast, at least one member of Azov Regiment bragged about getting training from U.S. military trainers. He even said that there were volunteer engineers and medics from the U.S. military who were still assisting Azov Regiment. Obviously, white supremacist groups from the U.S. have met with Azov Regiment and have deep ties with them. One such group is the Rise Above movement, which has been charged with a series of violent attacks in California. Now, just like the Proud Boys, RAM bills itself as a white nationalist fight club, basically MMA with swastikas, which means they would fit right into Dana White's organization. In 2017, RAM was at the Unite the Right riot in Charlottesville. You can see 2 of their members in this photo. And in September 2017, only a few weeks after RAM and the other white supremacist groups went on their rampage, the founder of RAM, Robert Rundo, took part in a right-wing podcast in which he talked about Azov Battalion. He said that it was the Ukrainian white supremacist movements that had inspired him to start RAM in the first place because, as he put it, they really have the culture out there. They have their own clubs, they have their own bars, they have their own dress style. He called Azov Regiment the future. In 2018, members of the Rise Above movement were arrested for their part in the Charlottesville riot, including Rundo. 4 of the members of RAM would be charged and plead guilty to conspiracy to riot. None of them got more than 36 months. Rundo, however, didn't take a plea deal. He was counting on his white skin privilege to keep him out of prison. And he was right. In 2019, a California judge dismissed the charges against Rundo and 2 other members of his terrorist group, claiming, unbelievably, that the law he was charged under was unconstitutional. See, when you're white, the laws don't apply. Keep in mind, this is the guy who founded RAM. He wasn't some rando thug who joined up. He was the ringleader of this terrorist organization. Now, the feds appealed the judge's ridiculous ruling, but while the appeal was making its way through the courts, Rundo took that as his opportunity to skip the country and hide out in Ukraine, accompanied by some of his white supremacist pals. Since then, he's bounced around between a few Eastern European countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, and at last report he was in Serbia. Judging by the slaughter they've unleashed in Ukraine, we can see exactly what kind of future Rundo and the rest of the trash he represents want for the United States. But the violence inspired by those Ukrainian neo-Nazis was only just getting started. March 15th, 2019. White supremacist Brenton Tarrant carried out the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, in which he slaughtered 51 people. As it turned out, just 4 years earlier, Tarrant had gone to Ukraine. Now, while detailed reports of what Tarrant was doing there are not known, what is known is that the New Zealand government admitted that he had made contact with a number of right-wing groups, not just one, a number of them. Few in the white media thought to connect Tarrant's horrific act to Ukraine at the time, and you don't see anybody discussing it now. Tarrant even wore a black sun patch on his clothing. It's a symbol popular among white supremacists worldwide, including Azov Regiment. Sounds a lot like Dylann Roof now, don't it? The white supremacists all operate out of the same playbook. You'll also recall that Tarrant made sure to live stream the mass murder because Facebook has been one of Azov Regiment's most important and successful recruitment tools. It's where Azov and their racist pals like to congregate. After the massacre, Tarrant became a hero to the Ukrainian neo-Nazis who were publishing his so-called manifesto and doing whatever they could to make him into some sort of sick folk hero among their ranks. But Tarrant wasn't alone. There's been a number of U.S. military personnel who have been going to Ukraine for the same reasons that Tarrant did. 6 months after Tarrant carried out his massacre, Jarrett William Smith, a U.S. soldier stationed in Fort Riley, Kansas, was arrested by the FBI for, among other things, planning a bombing spree and distributing information relating to weapons of mass destruction. That's a popular theme among the white nationalists, if they can get their hands on chemical, biological, or even nuclear material. Smith also planned to go to Ukraine to fight alongside Azov Regiment. He never made it there, but he was in contact with a number of U.S. soldiers who had. For years, Jarrett Smith had already been in contact with another American soldier, Craig Lang, who acted as Smith's mentor. Lang had already traveled to Ukraine, and when he got there, he joined Right Sector. And this Lang character is an interesting one too. According to court documents, in 2017, while in Ukraine, Lang had met another Army veteran, Alex Ziefelhofer, and both of them fought for Right Sector. In June 2017, Lang and Ziefelhofer went to Kenya because they claimed they wanted to fight the al-Qaeda-linked group Al-Shabaab. They only got as far as South Sudan before they were sent back to the U.S., but I think we all know what their real purpose was in going to Africa. They wanted to get in some practice killing black people. They were tired of just killing other white folk. Now it's time to get to the real targets. And don't be so naive as to think that they were wanting to take on some armed terrorists. These scumbags look for soft targets. These are the kind of creeps who go to these African countries, and then when we hear about children who turn up missing and later are found dead, we're wondering who did it. It was guys like him. And what were Lang and his pals doing while they were in Ukraine? The Department of Justice has opened an investigation into Craig Lang and 6 other U.S. citizens for their alleged role in torturing Ukrainian separatists while they were fighting alongside the neo-Nazis in Right Sector back in 2015. The investigation of Lang is the very first time that a U.S. citizen has been investigated under the U.S. War Crimes Act, which was passed in 1996. Craig Lang has since been charged with killing a Florida couple in 2018, so as you can see, this little monster's been very busy. He's since returned to Ukraine, where in October 2021, a Ukrainian court ruled that he could be extradited back to the U.S. But even so, the Ukrainian authorities have been dragging their feet on that, and since the outbreak of the war, Lang is an even lower priority than he was before. He's currently trying to seek asylum status in Ukraine. Now, considering that this guy has a Ukrainian wife and even a child now, the white supremacists who run that country might decide to let him stay.
ABC News traveled to Ukraine and found Craig Lang living openly in Kyiv with his new Ukrainian wife and child. He agreed to sit down with us, but refused to answer any questions about the murders in Florida, in which he denies any involvement.
I can't discuss any of these things, anything about Florida, pretty much anything about my time in the United States in 2018. I can't talk about any of that.
Lang claims he's a victim of Russian propaganda and U.S. political persecution.
A lot of the media goes around with saying that I'm a right-wing extremist, that I'm, a Nazi or any of these things, and I feel that I'll be persecuted as being a right-wing extremist or a far-right person, even though I'm not.
Lang is among the reportedly growing number of Americans who have gone to fight for far-right paramilitary organizations in Ukraine. During Russia's 2014 invasion in Crimea, Ukraine's army was in disarray and turned for help to civilian-formed volunteer battalions, some of them tied to fringe far-right political parties.
We are starting to see racially motivated violent extremists connecting with like-minded individuals overseas online, certainly.
FBI Director Christopher Wray has repeatedly warned about Ukraine's far-right militias' appeal to U.S. domestic extremists and the possibility that they could return to the U.S. more radical and violent. In 2016, Ukraine Today shadowed Lang as he fought Russian-backed separatists.
I came to Ukraine to come and help the Ukrainian people.
Lang has downplayed the role of white supremacists and neo-Nazis in Ukrainian militias and denies being an extremist himself, but can be seen here in this 2016 photo beside a right sector member giving a Heil Hitler salute.
But you're well aware that there are far-right ideologies represented in the mix, right?
I'm going to say that the amount of like neo-Nazis or people with extreme views is very, very minimal. Very, very minimal. Is there extremism to a small degree? There might be some extremism, yeah.
There might be.
There might.
You don't accept that that's part of the reality?
No, I don't accept that that's part of a reality here. I mean, I've had black people in my unit serving alongside with me.
Have you also had Nazis?
I've seen people that want to claim that they might be a Nazi, but I don't think that that's their actual ideology.
They've got black members in their death squad, what he called a unit. Now, of course, as soon as I heard him say that, I thought this was most likely some biracial person he's talking about, almost certainly a foreigner, definitely not an FBA DAS person, right? Of course not. Don't have to be a PhD to figure that one out. The token Negro in Lang's death squad is an Austrian national named Benjamin Fischer. Clowns like this Fischer tool, they never figure out that they're just a team mascot for the white supremacists. He's just a useful idiot. Whenever these violent white supremacists get their butts in a crack or they get called out, why, they can always refer to their black friend. Of course, that's the only time the white supremacists ever mention their black buddy, whenever they got their butts in a crack and they need something to say in their own defense, however lame it may be. But the point of bringing this up is that there have already been a large number of U.S. military personnel who have gone to Ukraine and now function as terrorist cells plotting all kinds of murder in the U.S. The problem isn't just Azov Regiment. It's Azov, Right Sector, C-14, and the untold numbers of white supremacists all over the world who these guys have linked up with. They are the nexus for a worldwide white extremist terrorist movement. As I mentioned before, in March 2018, Congress finally restored the provision to the defense bill that would prohibit money from going to Azov Regiment, but let's be honest. Ukraine is famously corrupt. Azov and these other neo-Nazi groups, they've got their people at all levels of the government. That's part of the reason they weren't allowed to join NATO. That government couldn't be trusted. Does anyone seriously believe that a government that is corrupt and racist enough to allow an open neo-Nazi militia to become an official part of their military is also going to rein them in or do something about them or otherwise weed them out? Does anyone believe that any government corrupt enough to allow a neo-Nazi organization to set up their own political party and to make sure that the cops are out there on patrol with them is going to then withhold money and weapons from that group? Ukraine is a nexus for white supremacists, and it has been for many, many years. This is what was being reported before a few weeks ago. But because of the necessities of the moment, it's no longer politically expedient to mention that anymore. The same white media organizations who had previously reported on all of this neo-Nazi activity in Ukraine are now disavowing their own reporting or desperately trying not to mention it. And this matters because when ISIS was most active in Syria, there was a flood of foreign fighters who went there to join because they wanted to get practical, actual war experience so they could then go back to their home countries. We saw the same thing in Afghanistan. Well, the white supremacists have been doing the same thing in Ukraine for about as long. The white media is telling everyone that we have an obligation to ignore Azov Regiment and all the other neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Sure, they've been reporting for several years that these guys are going over to Ukraine and that they've been looking to gain real-world military expertise so they can bring it back here and fight a race war in the U.S., but we can't worry about that because A, the targets of these white supremacists are black, and B, Putin. As Newsweek themselves put it just a few days ago, quoting Jonathan Crunson, a former U.S. Embassy officer, "We can't call out the white supremacist over there because that would undermine Ukraine's military." As he put it, people like us are overstating the more radical elements in the Ukrainian army. Overstating it? We can't afford to undermine Ukraine's military? Gee, that sounds just like the Azov Regiment commanders who USA Today spoke to 7 years ago, don't it? It also sounds just like Joy Reid, too. Brunson would also add that today is not the time to criticize Ukraine's military. Nope, it's never the right time to call out white supremacy, is it? We just need to wait. See, when a black person is killed by some white supremacist, it's never the wrong time to bring up any priors that black person might have had, any brushes with the law, no matter how minor, and if you can't find anything on the black victim, then see if there's any dirt on their family or friends. Yeah, that line about this isn't the time to criticize, it only gets dragged out when the person being criticized isn't black. If neo-Nazis aren't the end-all and be-all of the Ukrainian military, if they are a separate issue from the Ukrainian military, then discussing the neo-Nazi elements and making it a point to identify them and root them out, or to, at the very least, to isolate them should they return to the U.S., that ought to be a pretty straightforward deal, shouldn't it? After all, it's a separate issue. Except it's not about the ideology of these terrorists. It's about maintaining white solidarity. These are the irregular forces of white supremacy. So what Joke Reid said about maintaining unity, that's part of a white supremacist script. This is an organized propaganda front. The same Newsweek who is steadily reporting on the white supremacists in Ukraine is now saying now's not the time to talk about them. Okay, and when should we be able to talk about them again? After they come back to the U.S. and commit some ghastly act of violence a la Dylan Roof or Brenton Tarrant? Both of them went to a place of worship to commit their massacres. Now would be the time to start a list of individuals who have gone over there to Ukraine to be tracked and traced. In a post-January 6th world, you would think that would be a priority, but it's not. We can't afford to discourage or otherwise hinder the irregular forces of white supremacy now, can we? See, Ronald Rundo isn't the only one who thinks that what Azov Regiment's doing in Ukraine is the future. Neo-Nazi street patrols sanctioned by the state, neo-Nazi schools, and open mass killings of non-white groups. There's a lot of white supremacists over here who want that same future for the U.S. Right now, they're in Ukraine, putting their eggheads together with the same white supremacists who they've been on again, off again, seeing, talking to, and training with. Now they're going to be able to sit down and really have some in-depth planning for the massacres to come after all this war with Russia blows over. The white media has been trying to, albeit very subtly, start a narrative of redemption for Ukraine. The narrative goes like this. Viktor Yanukovych was voted out, beaten by a guy who Putin's agents had tried to poison. The vanquished Yanukovych then came into contact with Paul Manafort, who would later go on to work for Trump's campaign, and with a little coaching from Manafort, Yanukovych was able to get reelected. But his endless corruption, along with his attempts to bring Ukraine closer to Russia's political orbit, reminded people why they voted him out in the first place, so they had their revolution in 2014 and Yanukovych ran for his life. There were some other thugs and ne'er-do-wells who were in Ukraine's office, but for the most part, Russia's power had been broken. And the hordes of neo-Nazi groups that sprung up after the Maidan Revolution of 2014, well, those are just the messy excesses of freedom. And it doesn't matter anyway, because in 2019, Vladimir Zelensky won office running on a platform of, well, reform. But as we've always said to you, white supremacists cannot be reformed. They can only be punished. Now the white media has made it a point to mention every 5 seconds that Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish, and so is his prime minister, so there's no way that a bunch of neo-Nazis would be running around. Folks, that flies in the face of history and realpolitik. The United States had a biracial president for 8 years. And he allowed the white supremacists to run wild and didn't do anything about it, and they re-elected him in 2012. The idea that just because somebody's not part of one of these neo-Nazi groups or isn't considered to be Aryan, that person's going to be fighting against them, please. They've got these guys intimidated, cowed, or in many cases, got these guys holding out for something better. Just like Obama, Zelensky knows full well that he is grossly outnumbered by all of these card-carrying white supremacists all around him. And he also understands that the exact same violent thugs who overran the Ukrainian capital and sent Yanukovych packing could easily and would easily do the same thing to him. And the main justification that they would be using for it would be to say that he's Jewish, so he can't be trusted. White supremacy understands the need to do whatever is expedient to its short-term and long-term goals. So that's what's going on right now. All of these white supremacists who for the last decade or so have been going over and finding their little pen pals in Ukraine, now they're going to have an opportunity to do some real in-depth planning and brainstorming with these guys. And we haven't even gotten to the subject of all of the Ukrainian refugees who are going to be coming over here. You better believe there's going to be a number of these white supremacists who are going to be doing everything that they can to tell the State Department, oh, we'll sponsor this guy. You let him come over. I know him. I'll vouch for him. All right, now, that's the bad news. What's the good news? First of all, this is the U.S. It ain't Ukraine. And that's significant because unlike Ukraine, there happens to be a large and, when we put our minds to it, very well-motivated group of ex-slaves who have and will continue to drop the hammer on these white supremacists. There is practically no instance where, when we fought the white supremacists, we have lost. We have very few losses against them whenever we decide that we're going to put the arm on the bastards. Our problem is we've been consistently inconsistent. One day we're riding herd on them, the next day we're just sitting back with our feet propped up. That ain't gonna work. We have to put our foot up their behinds and keep it up their behinds, and any of their Ukrainian racist buddies who decide they're gonna come over here and back them up. We know that the government is going to be trying to protect them, but there's no protection the government can give that black people cannot strip away if we are focused on doing so. And if these bastards decide that they're going to be pulling any of that race war crap over here, by the time we're done, they're going to look back on the war with Russia as being the good old days. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Mandisa, Quee, CJ Link, Isaac, and Gail Johnson. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.